Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Many of you are familiar patrons, and a few of you are not. Welcome to all of you. My name is Penny Wright, and I wish I could say that this evening was my idea, but I don't think it was. Actually, I'm not sure which of you gentlemen had this idea, but we thought it was a brilliant one. It was Tip, right? Was it Tip? Oh, no, it was John. Okay, John. Okay. So, anyway, they're here, you're here, we're delighted. For those of you who are not members of our library district, which is the Southampton Tuckahoe School District, take one of our newsletters. And if you want to make sure you get a newsletter every 3 months, which is always a good idea, join our Friends of the Library. Pay whatever you want, and you'll get a newsletter in the mail. So, that's really great. All right, I will introduce the three guests who are known to many of you already. And we'll start from your right with John Andrews. Thank you for being here, John. John received his doctorate in physics from the University of Notre Dame in 1967, and he later obtained a professional engineer's license from New York State. After 10 years of research and teaching, he settled into a more applied research position at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, first in solar energy and then in energy-efficient buildings. From 1989 until his retirement in 2003, he collaborated with another laboratory on ways to reduce energy losses in residential and small commercial air duct systems. This collaboration showed that the energy wasted from air leakage and inadequate insulation was the equivalent to the power of 500 to 1,000 hydrogen bombs every year. But because it was spread out over 50 million duct systems, it had gone unnoticed. Because of his research, improving air duct efficiency has risen to the top echelon of recommended measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from small buildings. Since his retirement, Dr. Andrews has been active in the Unitarian Universalist congregation, this is a common theme here, in Bridgehampton, serving as its president for 3 years and spearheading the installation of a 24 kilowatt solar panel system on the church roof. He also serves as co-leader of the Long Island East chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, which aims to reduce America's carbon emissions by placing a fee on fossil fuels and returning the proceeds to the American people in equal shares. Please welcome John Andrews. Seated next to John is Edson, known as Tip Rowland. He has had more than 40 years of experience in the management of technical projects and large organizations as an executive in government and industry, and also as an independent consultant. Tip's professional responsibilities have included development of nuclear propulsion plants for submarines, including the world's only nuclear-powered deep submergence research submarine. He has also been involved in the design of nuclear and fossil-fired power plants. He was a vice president at Burns and Rowe Incorporated, a national architect engineering firm. In the design and operation of nuclear fusion test devices, he was deputy director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, and research and development for civilian nuclear reactors. He was deputy assistant secretary and acting assistant secretary for nuclear energy at the Department of Energy. Mr. Brolin earned a BS summa cum laude from Tufts University and an MS from George Washington University. Since his retirement, he's been active in the local community, including having responsibility for construction of the Unitarian Universalist Meeting House in Bridgehampton for 3 years. He also chaired the Sustainable Southampton Green Advisory Committee to the Southampton Town Board, which helped pass several progressive pieces of legislation leading to improved sustainability for Southampton. Tip lives in Watermill with his wife, Rania, who is here. Please welcome Tip Rowland. To Tip's right, your left, is Stewart Larry, PhD. Dr. Stewart Larry was born and raised in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the home of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and birthplace of the atomic bomb. He is the fourth son of a chemical engineer and a medical technician and a housewife who immigrated from New York to work on the Manhattan Project in 1944. He followed a youthful passion for plants to his PhD in botany in 1982 from the University of Michigan and wandered in the wilderness for several years before they found him, and before taking a job with a nature conservancy in East Hampton in 1994. As an employee of the Conservancy, he has helped participate in raising billions of public dollars for conservation and to protect thousands of acres of open space in our region, just in our region alone. Not the billions, but thousands. Okay. He is currently the director of the Nature Conservancy on Long Island's water quality program, which is dedicated to reducing the amount of nitrogen pollution and also to restoring our near shore and coastal and marine habitats, which includes clams and scallops. He is a longtime member of, you guessed it, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Southport Virginia. Please welcome Stewart Larry. So Stewart, we will turn it right over to you.
Let's get started. I'm afraid we used up half our time with the introduction. I'll go very quickly. In order to talk about junk science and false science and crazy science, we have to settle our minds on what good science is first and what science does and what it means. So I'm going to start out, I hope, with a relatively quick overview of what science is, so that when you hear about what science isn't, it makes a little bit more sense. All right, so let's start with what does science do? Science is a toolbox. It's a methodology. It gives us a way to rigorously answer lots and lots of questions. And the fundament of most of those questions is, why did that happen and not something else? So science is our process in this world, in this time and place, for deciding what is true in our universe. And as Neil deGrasse Tyson famously said, it does it better than anything else we have ever come up with as human beings. Science has one major operating assumption. It's called naturalism. And naturalism, as a philosophical approach, has a series of principles which guide the way that science examines the world around it. The big assumption of naturalism is the world is WYSIWYG. Who remembers WYSIWYG from the 1980s? This was the great holy grail of getting what you were going to produce in a computer to show up as it was going to come out of your printer, but on your screen. That was a huge accomplishment. It means what you see is what you get. And science believes that's the way the world is structured. It assumes that nature alone is the entire reality. The material world is the real world. Physical world is a closed system. The laws of nature are unchangeable. The mind is subordinate to matter. Senses are the gateway to knowledge. And matter is the ultimate reality. Those are the principles of naturalism. Naturalism and methodological naturalism are the underpinnings of science. It is the only set of assumptions that science makes. Okay. Evidence. Evidence is how we drive science along. Evidence is stuff that we see, that we can measure, that we can touch, that we can detect in some fashion. It's observations, like I drop a ball, it falls. Green plants, when they're in the sun, grow up towards the sunlight. The sky is blue, at least on those rare, clear days we've had this spring. It's been pretty miserable. So we gather evidence. Science gathers evidence, looks at the evidence. It wants to find out what's replicable, what kind of evidence shows up again and again, and it looks for patterns in the way that we find evidence. So one of the more remarkable patterns that emerged through careful scientific study is the periodic table of the elements. More remarkable because when Mendeleev put it together, many of those elements were not known. He had put together a relationship, a set of relationships based on repeating patterns of elemental properties. That's the basis of our modern periodic table. So if you want to really dive into how the universe is put together, that's your portal. So science assumes that our universe is in fact structured by underlying fundamental rules, of which that is a piece of evidence, a lot of evidence. And it further assumes that these rules are constant across the universe. And science goes further. It says the reason for patterns in evidence is knowable and explainable. We call this process of explaining patterns in evidence building on hypothesis, or building on hypothesis. Science makes predictions. Those predictions are hypotheses. And to be scientific, a hypothesis has to do two things. It has to describe that which will happen, and it has to exclude those things which cannot happen. And as you look at this picture of Hurricane Sandy on October 26th, Hurricane Sandy is going to hit probably somewhere in southern New Jersey. It is not going to land in Oklahoma. Those are two reliable scientific predictions, and we can test them, we can verify them, they tell us something about the world around us. A hypothesis connects evidence to a cause. It's not good enough to have a hypothesis, it's not good enough to have patterns in evidence. You have to explore what's happening that allows the cause to emerge. What's the mechanism? So how is it that you build a correlation? So this is a faux correlation here, which shows the relationship between highway fatalities and the importation of fresh lemons. So as we import more lemons, highway fatalities drop. The problem with something like this, while the correlation, as you can see, is quite good, is that there's no mechanism that could possibly connect those two things. That's not science. And my colleagues here will get into this in some detail. There's no underlying mechanism that would explain why this is meaningful or why that would happen. So it's not science, it's something else. All right, we can go through a process of testing hypotheses against evidence, against methodologies, and build out a verification over time. And every time we test a particular hypothesis, no matter how we go after it, we are unable to falsify it. We can't prove it's wrong. We can't find a problem with it. At a certain point, science says, we have achieved what we call an emergent scientific truth. That's deGrasse Tyson's language again, which is pretty good. It doesn't mean that we haven't changed our appreciation or the subtleties of something. For example, Newtonian physics, very good at slow speeds and small masses. Einsteinian physics, very good at fast speeds and large masses. But the one does not get rid of the other, it adds to the other. So some of the things which we accept in the world of science as emergent scientific truth, relativity, climate change, the germ theory of disease, the modern theory of evolution, I will point out here that evolution is accepted as a fact by science. The theory of how evolution occurs is a theory. But the fact that evolution has occurred is not a theory. That is a fact. Gravity, also accepted as a scientific truth. As Neil deGrasse Tyson says, the great thing about science is it's true, whether you believe it or not. So, a few other things about science. It's hard. It's important that we respect and understand just how difficult it is to get a rigorous result. This is Jbs Haldane, who was the 1940s equivalent of Carl Sagan, quite a character, who's emerging from, hard to see, a pressure vessel he used in testing the effects of high pressure on human physiology. And he was his own guinea pig for this. Haldane is also supposed to have famously said, the universe is not only stranger than we suppose, it's stranger than we can suppose. Setting the stage for lots of interesting conjecture. Another great commenter on science, Karl Popper, probably one of the greatest science philosophers of the 20th century, makes two observations about science that you should hang on to. One is that scientific theories are bold in two ways. And the principal way in which they go after their boldness is they go counter to received or intuitive claims about the universe and nature. The second thing that science does, which is different from religion, is they posit testable claims that future observations might reveal to be false. So what Popper is saying, fundamental to science, is that to be a scientific theory, a notion must be disprovable or falsifiable. You have to be able to imagine the experiment that you would do and the result that you would get that would prove this scientific finding wrong. If you can't do that, you're not in the realm of science. So lots of people think those things. Lots of people are out there trying to disprove particular tenets of science. They're called graduate students. And every young grad student knows her career is set for life if she can debunk, amend, or otherwise unseat a cherished hypothesis of some other person, particularly a competing professor. Anyway, science is therefore self-correcting. Errors, mistakes, deceits, lies get washed out because that's the way grad students make their way into the future. All right, there are other ways of looking at the world around you. And one of the one of the ways of describing that that's come out in the last 5 or 10 years is what's called tribal epistemology. This is the idea that we believe things to be true, not because there's any evidence, not because it's science, but because it's important for the cohesion of the group that we belong to and for our sense of belonging to that group. Tribal epistemology. We know what's true because it's for the tribe's good. Tribal epistemologies in general are not interested in evidence or replicability. They're not interested in general predictive utility. And tribal epistemology isn't interested in falsification. Indeed, if you go into most forms of tribal epistemology, what you'll discover is they are rigorously and rigidly immune to falsification. Any form of falsification is discarded as irrelevant to the tribal belief system that you are approaching. So it's not science. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, you are entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts. And Ricky Gervais has added, opinions don't affect facts, but facts should affect opinions, and do if you're rational. So we have a problem in this country. All right, a couple of other things, and then I'll give the rest of the speakers a little time. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you want to say that something about science is false, if you want to say that the theory of evolution is incorrect, you'd better have some pretty amazing evidence to prove that. Otherwise, that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Just because science doesn't know everything doesn't mean that you can fill in the gaps with whatever fairy tale most appeals to you. So we're in a funny place in this country. How do we fix it? Science is primarily a methodology, not a belief system. So science isn't going to give you the tools to fix things that are belief systems. Science is effective at ferreting out the truth. So what do? When we're confronted with people who aren't interested in science, the truth, or the scientific method, or rational behavior, or rational thinking? I would urge you to go to that last line here. You probably don't want to engage the shopkeeper that you frequent in Southampton, but please don't give your friends and acquaintances free passes to step on science. If they want to have particular tribal epistemological approaches to the world, good, but science is not tribal epistemology. Science is a methodology, and we should trust it and embrace it.
I'm going to give you some examples. There are countless examples of fake science around the world. I'm going to give you 3, an easy one, a harder one, and the hardest one. And you have to determine how you're going to know the difference, whether it's fake or not. I'll help you out. First, it's Joe Newman and his energy machine. Mr. Newman, for many years, he's no longer with us, insisted that with his energy machine, he didn't need any energy input. For example, he could run this car, which he drove around the New Orleans Superdome, on one transistor battery. Okay? Sound like a good deal? Well, he could do that and more because his machine made its own energy, otherwise known as a perpetual motion machine. Should we invest? Actually, some people did. And CBS News had it twice. Dan Rather, with a very little rebuttal from any scientific person. Thousands paid to watch it at the Superdome. There was a little problem. He didn't have any proof that would be scientifically reviewable. Unfortunately, his scheme, and any perpetual motion machine, violates the first law of thermodynamics. I'm sure you all remember that, but I'll remind you. Energy can be transformed, but not created. So there's a fixed amount of energy in the world. You may change uranium into heat. You may make chemical reactions, but you can't create new energy. It also, more importantly to me, violates the first law of common sense, which is you don't get something for nothing. Now, the U.S. Patent Office got tired, I think it was 1911, of reviewing perpetual motion machines. So the leader of the Patent Office, a very wise man, said, okay, we won't review any more patent applications for perpetual motion machines until you've delivered a working model of your machine to us and it's run for a year. They haven't got any takers yet. That was over 100 years ago. But people just continue to bring this up. And as I note at the bottom there, it had 1,500 batteries in the car that drove around the Superdome, but he neglected to mention that. So that was a relatively easy one. Presumably, we'd all catch up. Although, as I say, he did have investors for his machine. This one's a harder example, and it requires quite a bit of knowledge in order to test it. Cold fusion, some of you may remember this from 1989, and I happened to be working at the Princeton Blossom Physics Laboratory at the time, and that was what we did, except our fusion research was what's called hot fusion. Fusion is simply when two hydrogen nuclei fuse together, they give off a lot of energy. A hydrogen bomb is one example of this. So if we can tame this, we can make our energy from the hydrogen in water. So it's a potentially inexhaustible energy source, and that's the good news. The bad news was that we've spent billions of dollars and more than 60 years trying to make it work, and it has worked. There have been sustained fusion reactions for a few seconds, maybe up to 30 seconds. But in 1989, two chemists who were reputable scientists claimed to the press, they didn't publish anything on this, they claimed to the press that they were able to do fusion at room temperature instead of 180 million degrees, which is what the hot fusion does. So instead of using this device, which was at Princeton, and the arrow points to a person, so you can see this is a pretty sizable device, it cost a lot of money, and it was very complicated, and we used it to test whether hot fusion worked. They were saying they can do it in this, which was a tabletop jar filled with what's called heavy water. Well, if you could, everyone at our laboratory would have been immediately gone. But the public loved it, at least for a short time. The press picked up on it. And there was a congressional hearing where some congressman offered to take money out of the hot fusion budget and give it to the University of Utah, which is where Dr. Bonds was located. However, in parallel, in fact, immediately, the very night that it was observed, all around the world, literally, physicists tried to duplicate the result. This was certainly true at Princeton, because, as Stewart mentioned, in order for a scientific result to be accepted and acceptable, it has to be reproducible. That's when the graduate students come in and the other scientists who just love to prove that whatever you just discovered is wrong. So at PPL, we tried to do this. Had we been successful, the laboratory would have been shut down. But it didn't matter because the people who were doing it really wanted to know whether it worked.
But just have to add, many groups tried to reproduce this, many of whom had no interest in it one way or the other. They were physicists whose funding wouldn't have been lost in either case. So it was that there were physicists at Brookhaven, which and they weren't involved with fusion research of any kind. So there were a lot of attempts to reproduce this, and none of them.
Right. And in fact, over the years, and this lasted, the bubble was short, but literally cold fusion research was funded for a number of years, mainly by the Japanese, who hoped it would work and they'd be on the moon. But it didn't, and cold fusion was gone. So that's how hard it was. The person on the street really wouldn't know. It required scientists to get involved and assess whether the proposal was valid or not. Here's a third one, which will probably, hopefully, I won't offend many people, but your belief systems now come into play. What Stewart was talking about. This is a statement which was made in a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by four academics. They not only could we run our entire economy on renewable energy, but we could do it cheaper than with fossil fuels. The study was published, and most of the experts in the field didn't take it seriously because there were many previous studies which didn't show this result, let's put it that way. But they didn't take it seriously until people started using it to support policy. Various groups who wanted to be true picked up on it and said, aha, we knew it all along. And so it was used for this purpose. At that point, various scientific experts became quite alarmed. I'm taking this from the article that was eventually published, which I'll get to in a minute, and also this was in the New York Times, June 20th, 2017, which is where I first saw what I'm about to tell you. So they did their own study, also published in the National Academy of Sciences, a wider study using more disciplines than the initial study used. And they concluded that it was beyond a doubt not valid for the reasons cited there. For example, I'll give you two examples. The study assumed, and you never know this unless you read the technical paper, which almost no one would do unless they were very interested in this. It assumes that we would generate 10 times the hydroelectric power which the authors were using for storage, then we currently generate an amount equal to the entire capacity of all of our electrical power plants. And we do it in existing facilities, and it wouldn't cost much at all. Well, you have to really dig into the fine print to figure that one out. Another one was, the study assumed that every hospital, home, factory, building would have underground energy storage for when the sun didn't shine or the wind didn't blow or whatever, both for heating and cooling, which would be fantastic, and that airplanes would run on hydrogen, not fossil fuels, just to name a few. So, it was disproven. But why is this a problem? Why are we concerned about it? Why should you be concerned about it? I mean, if scientists take care of these problems, then the public needn't get involved. But the problem is bad science leads to bad policies. Bad policies lead to potentially catastrophic results. When you get bad policies, money goes in the wrong direction. Money goes into dead ends. Human resources go into dead ends. Your own psychic resources. If you go out and march for something, you want to make sure that it's worth marching for, that it's not Joan's energy machine. So, in the renewable energy example there, the result of believing the initial study would be that billions of dollars would be directed in a direction. I'm not, by the way, I'm not thinking it's renewable energy. I have 10 kilowatts of it in my backyard. But the trouble is, Congress appropriates money for this. There's one scientist in Congress, one, out of 535 people. I've dealt with Congress, I've testified to Congress, and it is absolutely amazing. They're all bright people, and they know nothing about science or technical things that they have to vote on. It's not their fault, but it's a fact. So we have to be honest about this. If we direct money in the wrong direction, it'll lead us down a policy cul-de-sac. For example, if we believe that renewable energy by itself can solve the climate change problem, we want to invest in other carbon-free energy sources. And the result of that would be that we waste something we can't get back. Time. We waste time. Money, we can print more. Time, we can't get back. So we have to make these decisions as rigorously as we possibly can. So how do we detect it? That's the bottom line, and it's a little unfair because we can't detect, each of us can't detect all these things. First, be skeptical. I am guilty of the next item as well as many people. Don't believe it just because it reinforces your beliefs. Usually, or frequently, I should say, if you do dig into these things, one stops when one finds a source that agrees with one in the first place. Don't stop. Ask your friends, ask a scientist or an engineer whom you know. There are lots of us around. We aren't always very visible, but we're there. And look for non-sensational articles. There's a lot available on the internet. These National Academy of Science papers are available simply by clicking on links in the New York Times article. And keep in mind that most science that you read about in the paper is flawed. Over the years, various projects that I have been involved with have appeared in a news article or something like that. I can only remember one article that was accurate. The others were written by people who today they're writing about nuclear fission or fusion. Tomorrow they're writing about education. And so they do the best they can, but you really have to look into it yourself if you're going to become an advocate. If you're not interested or you aren't voicing an opinion, well, you can't be into everything. So, ask yourself if it's providing something for nothing. That's same old rule number one. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is to provide you with a toolkit for not to infallibly detect fakery, but to give you a few weapons to detect fakery. And it's based on this great book that was first published in the 1950s called How to Lie with Statistics. And it's well worth reading. And I really like the author of this book, as he explained, he's not trying to get you to lie with statistics, but to help tell when other people are pulling the wool over your eyes. And I have a handout that's over on the table there. You might want to take one home with you because there are some hints. So I want to give some examples. The first one is, here's some data from a hypothetical city of the crime rate as a function of year. And Mayor Smith took office in 2013, and now she has to run for re-election. And if you look at the data, it looks like, well, hey, you know, maybe she had something to do with the tremendous drop in crime. This data by itself don't prove that. Maybe something else caused the drop in crime. But it certainly looks good for Mayor Smith, and certainly Mayor Smith's opponent is going to want to try to cast the data in a somewhat different way.
Remember lemons? Traffic fatalities.
So here's what they come up with, and they say, here's the history of crime under Mayor Smith in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And no, this is the same data. Now, of course, people make up fake data. But the point here is that even without making up fake data, simply by adjusting how you present it, you can shift things so that they did two things. First of all, they cherry-picked the years that they were going to show. They didn't show the other years where the crime rate was in the 500s. They only show these 3 years. And also note that they start the graph at 60, which greatly exaggerates the difference between the 3 years. And it seems like, well, Mayor Smith took office, and it took a couple of years for her terrible policies to cause crime to go up, but now you're seeing the results. And so that's what you'll see when the dark money comes in and wants to defeat Mayor Smith. That's what you'll get in your mailbox. And unless Mayor Smith has a ton of money to present the other side, you'll vote for Mayor Smith's opponent because you're afraid of
Could you articulate what the y-axis was there?
the number of crimes in this city per year.
But what were the numbers?
60, 70,
No,
80.
the previous slide.
The same numbers. How do you do that?
Yeah.
Oh.
No, they're not.
Yeah, see 2014, 15, and 16.
Yeah, no, it's the y-axis.
The y-axis is the number of crimes in that particular
Yeah, but
city.
the
It's how-
y-axis has changed dramatically, which is why it's making those.
That's
the
what he
second
just said.
slide look so bad.
That's right. And
That's what he said.
And so at any rate, you're taking the only 3 years and not all the years, and you're starting the axis at 60 and not 0, and that makes it look like a tremendous rise, a more tremendous rise than it was. And again, the point is that this has been used in reality. In the 1980s, Mayor Harold Washington of Chicago was hit with this kind of a strategy, I heard that on NPR after I made up these slides, and I said, oh, that's interesting. So the next thing is, This is a plot of global average temperatures between 1998 and 2011. And you look at it and you say, nothing much is happening. And this was the famous pause in global warming. And so a lot of deniers said, well, global warming is a crock because look at this, it's not really happening. But what they did was they cherry-picked the years. If you look at all the years, going back to 1964, this is what you see. And those particular years you can pick out. So they just picked some years where by the statistical fluctuation, it looked like nothing was happening. Interesting point. Some deniers say the climate change scientists are faking the data. Well, if you're faking the data, you don't put something like that in, because it gave them a lot of grief. And so the fact that there was something like that is exactly what you'd expect if you have a general trend that is also overlain by statistical fluctuations. That's what happens. But if you're faking the data, probably you're not going to put that in.
There are a lot of grad students waiting around to pick apart your fake data, people.
So cherry picking the data is one way to lie. Only show what supports your position, deep six what doesn't. Use misleading graphics to exaggerate a difference. Now, there are good reasons in scientific journals why they'll start a graph not at zero, but that's not to mislead the public. It's just to use the whole graph and make it clear. But if you see a graph that doesn't start at zero in a publication that's trying to convince you of something, it might not be intentionally obfuscatory, but it's worth taking with a grain of salt. Okay, misleading averages. Averages are great, but they can mislead. If Bill Gates came into this room, the average wealth of the people in this room would be well over $1 billion. So would you feel any richer if Bill Gates walked into the room? Probably not. But if somebody reported on the average wealth of the people in this room with Bill Gates in it, they would say that's the average and they'd be correct. But they would certainly be misleading. And averages are used all the time. If one of your feet's in ice water and the other's in scalding water, on average you're comfortable. Another is using biased samples. Now the example I'm giving here is a famous one from the 1930s when a defunct magazine called the Literary Digest did a study, a poll in the 1936 presidential election, and they predicted that Alf Landon would beat FDR. And of course, that's not what happened. And afterwards, they realized that they took their sample from people who owned cars and telephones. And of course, in the Depression, if you had a car or even a telephone, you were probably richer than the average person and more likely to be a Republican. And that was the example. They weren't intentionally doing that, but they got caught using a biased sample. And now, of course, people use biased samples intentionally if they want to convince you of something. This is an interesting one that scientists are really worried about. If you want to see an effect, do the experiment 20 times. And if you do that, even if there's no effect but just statistical fluctuations, it's very likely that one of them will show a positive result, just by chance. So then what you do is you publish that one and throw the other ones away. And this can be done, for example, extrasensory perception experiments are kind of like that. A lot of people do them, and the ones who get no result throw them away. Occasionally one seems to show that it's a real effect, and that gets publicity. But what scientists are worried about is that when scientists do studies, it's much easier to get published if you have a positive result than if you have a negative result. And that is a real worry that scientists are trying to address to remove that sort of bias. And here's one that others here have talked about, correlation and causation. Two things go hand in hand. It doesn't mean that A causes B. It could equally well that B causes A. But just as saliently, it could be that neither one causes the other, but they're both caused by something else. And One of my favorite examples is, I was looking at the energy efficiency of various states in terms of energy use per capita. And I noticed that the states that used more energy per capita seemed to be the ones that went Republican in the 1960 election. And the states that were more energy efficient were the ones that went for Hillary. And I made a graph of this, and I showed it to someone, and they said, oh, that's obvious, Democrats are more energy conscious. And then I said, boy, wait a minute, that could be. But then I thought, well, the states that went Democratic tend to be urban, and cities are more energy efficient than rural areas. We should realize that, they really are. And also, urban areas tend to vote Democratic. And so it was the urbanness that caused both of the other effects. So anytime you see a correlation, watch out. You can either pretend that correlation does mean causation in the example, but there's a flip side that sometimes people who are trying to obfuscate something will just trot out the mantra, correlation isn't causation, correlation isn't causation, which is what the tobacco industry got away with for years. The point is that when science does say what causes what, you should listen. All right. All of this was about skepticism, but sometimes, in fact very often, we do have to trust. We can't find out everything for ourselves. We don't have the time, we don't have the expertise, you know, we have lives to live. So I want to tell you 4 good reasons to trust the source. And the first one is, does the source have expertise directly related to the issue? If you want to know about something about biology, yes, I'm a physicist. I may have more expertise than someone who has no scientific training at all, but you should really talk to Stewart. He's a biologist. And similarly, the second one, is the source biased? Does the source have an ideology to defend? Does the source have a conflict of interest? And if so, take it with a grain of salt. But if the source is unbiased, that by itself doesn't prove they're right, but it's a data point in the direction of, maybe they should be listened to. The third one is that scientists have beaten into their skulls from day one of their education. Acknowledge the weak points in your own argument. And that's why scientists make lousy lawyers, because lawyers aren't supposed to show the weak points in their argument. If I were accused of a crime, I wouldn't want a scientist for my lawyer. I'd want a lawyer. But if you're trying to find out truth, if someone acknowledges the weak points in their own case, that's a good reason to give them a leg up. And the flip side of that is, if you expect them to be biased, and they say the conclusion that's opposite, that's another reason to give them a leg up. There was a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab who was skeptical about global warming, and he got funding from a climate change denier group, and he and his group did the study, and they came out to the conclusion, climate change is real. He didn't get any more funding from that source, but the fact that he was biased in one direction came out in the other direction is another data point in the direction of saying, hey, maybe there's something there. But then there are bad reasons to trust the source, and here's what we all do. And we do it regardless of whether we're liberal, conservative, religious, anti-religious, whatever. If the source shares my politics or my religion or my friendship, I naturally tend to believe them. Bad thing to do. There's no reason why someone who is like me is going to be any more truthful, any better in getting at the truth than someone who isn't like me. The next one, source is telling me what I already believe.
Yeah. I'll give you the opposite. I'm a nuclear engineer. Now, immediately people assume I'm a conservative Republican. There is no connection.
Right.
The source is telling me what I already believe. We tend to do this. We tend to read publications that we know are going to support our beliefs. We make friends with people who are like us. Liberals club together with liberals. Conservatives club together with conservatives. And each group believes that they have the only truth. And so if the source is telling you what you already believe, it doesn't mean they're wrong, it just means that's not a reason to believe them. Or, I know that so-and-so would never lie. But even so, they can be mistaken. There are honest mistakes. So even if there's someone who you know would absolutely never lie, they might just be wrong. And the last one is the one that really makes me laugh. The source is a celebrity. And nothing more needs to be said there. Advertisers make a lot of money, and celebrities make a lot of money depending on that one. So finally, this is what I leave you with. You can get lots of information on the internet, and some of it is even true. Thank you.
So when we take some questions, might we ask that people asking questions use this microphone so that we can hear your questions and all be on the same? Who has a question?
I have a comment.
Or a comment? Just hold it kind of close.
You've done an excellent job with the hard sciences. The same rules really apply to the soft sciences, finance, economics, psychology, etc. And that's a real problem because that affects most of our lives day to day. And the rules apply, there's no question. And that's all I wanted to say, is soft sciences can be far more difficult and far more prone to error because of that.
John, so if you're looking for a source that the layman can understand, and I'm married to a scientist, and Science Magazine is all around my house, and every now and then I try to understand it. But what sources do you trust that can give you good information on, say, a recent scientific discovery or something that's in the news?
Well, the first one that pops into my head would be Scientific American. I think they have a lot of good articles, and they tend to present, if science says something's definitely so, they say so. But if scientists really don't know for sure, they'll say that. Or if it's still undecided, or there are arguments on both sides of the issue, they'll say that too. They had a very good article on fracking, and they were very upfront that fracking is dangerous, but that there are other aspects of it that we know about. And I thought it was a balanced article, and so that would be the one I would. I also subscribe to Science Moods. I think the Science Times is pretty good. And I certainly wouldn't use the National Enquirer.
Probably a bad choice.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about medical aspects. There's all these universities put out things like the Harvard Health Letters, Johns Hopkins puts out the New York Times Science thing. Every channel has the medical expert that comes on. And I think we've all experienced that. We're all trying to get knowledgeable. We try to do what they said. And 2 years later, it's like, nah, that didn't really work. What is reliable there in those kinds of journals, or whatever you want to call
It's not my field.
Not my field.
It's not my field either, but I would say from a general statistical point of view, it's a lot harder to do medical studies in a statistically valid way than it is to do studies of elementary particles. Because elementary particles are all the same, and what you see generally is, I wouldn't say it's not susceptible to bias at all, but it's less susceptible to bias than in medical studies. Getting an unbiased sample is really what's the hardest thing to do, and so most studies don't use unbiased samples because they can't, and so they're struggling with that, and so that's really the difficulty there.
I think also you have to recognize that, and this isn't anything negative about doctors, but they're businessmen too. And we're all familiar with the pharmaceutical problem. So That gets back to a comment John made about consider the source and whether the source has something to gain by your following their opinion. Whether it's the surgeon who looks to surgery is the first option, or the drug company that wants to sell their product. And it's very hard. There is a big difference in it, but a very difficult difference between science and art. And I think we all understand that much of medicine, in fact, Dr. Physical mentioned this too, that medicine is still an art in many respects, particularly diagnosis. So it may not be a help, but you have to just think about that when you're talking to someone about it.
I guess I would just add that we all know of cases where a study came out and said, eggs are bad, you got cholesterol. Then another study comes out saying, well, no, eggs aren't bad. And you say, what's with this? And I guess the point I'd make in that example is that eggs do have cholesterol. And so when that's published, the original study probably had all sorts of caveats about, well, this doesn't necessarily prove that eggs are bad. But they do have cholesterol, and it has to be examined. But when it comes out in the press, all the caveats drop out. And so then a later study comes along and finds, well, they do have cholesterol, but they also have chemicals in it that help the body metabolize the cholesterol. Well, then you get a different result. But if you read the original studies, if they were good studies, most would have acknowledged the unknowns in what they were saying. It's when it gets translated to the press that the unknowns get dropped out because they want something sensational.
I have a question I'd like to ask you to comment on, and that is, do you feel that today, in the age that we are living in, I mean, obviously human nature probably hasn't changed, but are the consequences of things that people either believe or don't believe playing out in a scarier way now than they have in the past?
Yes.
Yes.
I think partly it's because the world is more connected. I don't do Twitter, but I do email, and I use the internet. So the consequences are spread far and wide more quickly. Partly it's because organizations, whether it's a government or private industry, are more powerful now. We're not as isolated as we used to be. So yes, they have more consequences. We have more information, but we have to use it more wisely, or we'll do ourselves in.
It's a generally accepted tenet within the scientific community now that we are confronted with an unprecedented disrespect for the value and purpose and function of science in our society. Witness the last 2 years, we've had massive marches supporting science as a process, as a methodology. Unimaginable 20 years ago, completely unimaginable 40 years ago, inconceivable. And yet, we did that 2 years ago and again this year, and everyone found it to be normative. Well, of course we're going to march to defend science. What kind of a world have we descended into?
I would just add, science gives us knowledge, but unfortunately it doesn't guarantee wisdom.
Question. I feel that science and scientists have a responsibility to educate society. It is very difficult to rely on experts when we don't hear them. If I could pick on climate change for a moment, I don't hear much from the scientists. I do hear a lot from news media and politicians about what climate change is all about.
We're here to try to correct that.
Well, yeah, I think scientists in general don't have a bully pulpit, whereas the news media and the politicians do, and so that's one thing. Scientists publish their work, and when they can, many of us do try to advocate. For example, Chip and I are very active in the Citizens Climate Lobby. And but because we're individuals, we don't have the same outlet as a celebrity or a major media figure. The other thing is that when scientists do try to get in the public eye, and they follow their training, which is to give a balanced, honest position, they often will give the weak points in their position, like global warming. Well, yeah, there's a lot that isn't known about the effect of clouds, and so they'll come out as weak or wishy-washy, whereas we know climate change is happening, and we know humans are causing it, and yes, but there are still some unknowns that need to be determined. Or evolution. We know evolution is a fact. We know that natural selection is a huge driver of evolution. There are a lot of things about evolution that are still to be determined. So you ask a scientist who's an expert in one of those things, they'll probably give you all the weak points, and they'll sound pretty wishy-washy, but the deniers won't do that. And that's, to my mind, that's the huge problem. So scientists get whipped. I've read a lot from scientists who have been really subjected to personal criticism and angst because people don't like what they're saying, and so they say, well, why am I doing this? I won't go on the media next time. Let somebody else do it. And we shouldn't do that, but it's human nature.
Well, also the media, and there was a discussion about this a few years ago, sort of have bent over backwards to present whatever they present, and then to present an opposing point of view, as if they were equivalent in some way.
Yes, a
And
very
they're
good.
not. So they're very, very responsible. I mean, to a large part, you know, I think.
Yeah,
to a large
excellent
extent.
point. If 1,000 scientists say A and there's one who has a PhD who says B, they'll present it as equal.
Or some version thereof.
This side versus that side.
Another comment on that, though, the opposite also happens. And Joe Newman's Energy Machine and his appearance on Dan Rather's news show, not once but twice, was accompanied by someone who knew nothing about the subject saying essentially nothing. That was the rebuttal.
Does anybody else have a
Because
question?
it's entertainment.
Well, I can safely speak for all of us, I think, when I say this was just a most interesting evening. So now you have to figure out your next topic, because we're going to have you back. But thank you all for coming, and thank you for your